My father looked me dead in the eye on his deathbed and whispered that his empire belonged only to his real children. I thought it was his final, cruelest insult, but when the lawyer reached into his briefcase and unsealed a yellowed, wax-stamped envelope, everything I knew completely shattered. The rain in Greenwich, Connecticut, didn't fall. It seemed to sneer, driving cold needles into the black umbrellas of the mourners gathered at the Oak Lawn Cemetery. Standing at the edge of the sprawling green canopy, shivering in a borrowed black trench coat, I felt exactly as I had my entire life, like an uninvited guest at a very exclusive party. My name is Lucy Jennings. If you looked at my birth certificate, the space for father was left blank for the first 7 years of my life. Eventually, it was quietly amended, stamped with the name of the man currently being lowered into the earth in a mahogany casket that cost more than my first 3 cars combined. Ronald Sterling. Ronald was a titan of East Coast logistics and real estate, a man whose name was etched into the sides of skyscrapers and the letterheads of powerful philanthropic boards. He was also a man who possessed a heart of solid, unyielding granite. I was his mistake. My mother, Sarah, had been a mid-level accountant at his firm in the late 90s. Their brief affair resulted in me, a quiet payoff, and a lifetime of ironclad NDAs. While my half-siblings, Victoria and Preston, grew up in a 20-room estate with sweeping views of the Long Island Sound, I grew up in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Queens. Ronald paid for my silence, not my comfort. He covered my tuition at a strict boarding school, mostly to keep me out of the local public system where reporters might start asking questions, but he never once attended a parent-teacher conference, a graduation, or a birthday. Across the open grave, Victoria and Preston stood flanked by their respective spouses. Victoria looked less like a mourning daughter and more like she was shooting an editorial for Vogue, clad in a perfectly tailored Tom Ford coat, her expression hidden behind oversized Chanel sunglasses. Preston, standing next to her, spent the entire eulogy nervously checking his platinum Rolex. They were the real children, the legitimate heirs born of Ronald's socially acceptable marriage to a shipping heiress who had passed away a decade prior. They barely acknowledged me. When I arrived at the cemetery, Victoria's eyes had swept over me with the kind of distaste usually reserved for something scraped off a shoe. Preston hadn't even looked up from his phone. I didn't want to be there. I hadn't seen Ronald in 5 years. Our last interaction had been a terse phone call when my mother died of ovarian cancer. I had called to tell him. He had asked me to send the funeral bill to his assistant. I didn't send the bill. I paid for it myself, taking out a loan to do so. So why was I standing in the freezing rain, watching his casket disappear? Because 3 days before he died, I received a hand-delivered letter from his personal attorney, Arthur Pendleton. It contained a single line in Ronald's sharp, impatient handwriting. "You will attend the funeral, and you will attend the reading of the will. If you do not, I will ensure the Jennings name is ruined posthumously." It was a threat. Classic Ronald. Even from the grave, he couldn't resist pulling the strings. After the service, there was no reception for me. The Sterling family retreated to their limousines, heading back to the estate for a catered gathering. I walked a mile in the rain to the local train station and took the Metro North back to the city, my damp clothes clinging to my skin. I spent the weekend wrapped in blankets in my tiny apartment, dreading Monday morning. I assumed the will reading was simply Ronald's final opportunity to rub his success and my exclusion from it in my face. Monday arrived with aggressive, unseasonable sunlight. The offices of Pendleton, Royce, and Hayes were located on the 42nd floor of a Madison Avenue high-rise. The lobby smelled of expensive leather, lemon polish, and old money. When the receptionist ushered me into the main conference room, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victoria and Preston were already seated at a massive, polished oak table. Victoria was sipping sparkling water, her posture rigid. Preston was tapping a Mont Blanc pen against a leather folio. "I still don't understand why she has to be here, Arthur," Victoria said loudly as I walked in, not bothering to lower her voice. She turned her icy glare toward me. This is a private family matter. Arthur Pendleton, a man who looked like he had been born in a three-piece suit sometime in the 1950s, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. Your father's instructions were explicit, Victoria. Miss Jennings must be present for the reading. Let's just get it over with, Preston muttered, shooting me a look of deep irritation. I have a board meeting at 2. I took a seat at the far end of the table, leaving a vast expanse of polished wood between myself and the legitimate Sterlings. I folded my hands in my lap, trying to make myself as small as possible. Sitting next to Arthur Pendleton was a younger lawyer, perhaps in his late 30s. I recognized him from the firm's directory. David Hayes, the newest named partner. While Pendleton looked tired and annoyed by the family drama, Hayes watched the room with a sharp, calculating intensity. Very well, Pendleton sighed, opening a thick leather binder. We are here for the reading of the last will and testament of Ronald Alistair Sterling. I must remind you all that this document is legally binding, and your father took extensive measures to ensure its execution. He cleared his throat, and the room fell dead silent. Pendleton began reading the dense legalese, his voice a monotonous drone that seemed designed to put the listener to sleep. He spent the first 20 minutes detailing the minor bequests. Charitable donations to a few select museums, purely for tax purposes, and legacy building. I knew. A modest pension for his longtime housekeeper, and the transfer of a few minor properties to distant cousins. Then, he reached the core of the estate. The heavy machinery of Ronald Sterling's wealth, regarding the bulk of my estate, including the controlling shares of Sterling Logistics, the residential properties located in Greenwich, Manhattan, and Aspen, and all liquid assets held in the primary trusts. Pendleton paused, taking a slow sip of water. Victoria leaned forward, her knuckles white. Preston stopped tapping his pen. I direct that these assets be divided equally between my legitimate issue, Victoria Sterling, and Preston Sterling. They are my real children, the true bearers of my legacy, and it is my wish that they continue the Sterling Empire unhindered. A collective exhale hissed through the room. Victoria offered Preston a tight, victorious smile. Preston leaned back in his leather chair, practically inflating with relief. They had won. The empire was theirs. I felt absolutely nothing. No surprise. No disappointment. This was exactly what I had expected. Ronald was confirming in death what he had practiced in life. I was an embarrassing footnote, entirely erased from the official narrative. Furthermore, Pendleton continued, and my stomach suddenly tightened. Why was there a furthermore? I recognized the existence of Lucy Jennings, Pendleton read, his voice losing some of its detached professionalism, growing slightly strained. He wouldn't look at me. To Lucy, the unfortunate consequence of my youthful indiscretion, I leave the sum of $1. $1. This bequest is made intentionally, with the express purpose of demonstrating that she was not forgotten in the drafting of this will, but rather deliberately excluded from any meaningful inheritance. Let it be known that my wealth belongs only to my real children. A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the room. The cruelty of it felt like a physical blow. It wasn't enough to simply leave me out. He had to legally enshrine my illegitimacy, to use his final words to slap me across the face in front of his real family. He had summoned me here purely for the theater of my humiliation. A sharp, barking laugh broke the silence. It was Victoria. Well, she said, her voice dripping with venomous amusement, I suppose that settles that. You can buy yourself a coffee from a vending machine on your way out, Lucy. Preston smirked, packing away his Mont Blanc pen. Dad always did have a dark sense of humor. Don't worry, Arthur. We won't contest the dollar. My face burned. My chest felt so tight I could barely draw breath. I wanted to scream, to flip the heavy oak table, to tear the smug expressions off their faces, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of my tears. I had survived Ronald's neglect for 30 years. I would survive his final insult. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. I grabbed my purse. I'll waive the dollar, I said, my voice shaking only slightly. Keep it. It seems you need it more than I do. I turned on my heel and began walking toward the heavy glass doors of the conference room. I just needed to get to the elevator. I needed to get out into the street where I could breathe. Miss Jennings, please wait. The voice didn't belong to Arthur Pendleton. It was sharper, younger. It cut through the room like a whip. I stopped, my hand resting on the brass handle of the door. I turned back. David Hayes, the younger partner, had stood up. He wasn't looking at Pendleton, and he certainly wasn't looking at Victoria or Preston. He was looking directly at me. "What is the meaning of this, David?" Pendleton asked, looking utterly bewildered. "The reading is concluded." "No, Arthur, it isn't," Hayes said calmly. He reached down into a locked leather briefcase at his feet and produced a thick, yellowed envelope. It was sealed with heavy red wax, bearing the Sterling family crest. "What is that?" Victoria demanded, her smug demeanor instantly replaced by a razor-sharp defensiveness. "Arthur just read the will. Everything is divided between Preston and me." Hayes ignored her. He walked around the table, holding the envelope in both hands. "Mr. Sterling retained Arthur as his primary counsel." "That is true," Hayes began, his voice projecting clearly across the room. "However, 10 years ago, Mr. Sterling approached me privately. He drafted a secondary, highly confidential document. A contingent codicil." "Contingent on what?" Preston snapped, standing up. "This is absurd. Arthur, control your partner." "Contingent," Hayes said, locking eyes with Preston, on the exact phrase Arthur just read aloud being executed in the presence of all 3 children. Specifically, "Let it be known that my wealth belongs only to my real children." The room froze. Pendleton looked like he was about to have a heart attack. "Ronald instructed me," Hayes continued, breaking the wax seal with a sharp snap that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room, "that if he lacked the courage to change his primary will before his death, this document was to be opened immediately upon the reading of that specific insult." Hayes pulled out a stack of aged, heavily notarized papers. "Miss Jennings," Hayes said, gesturing to my empty chair, "I suggest you sit back down. Your father's definition of his real children requires a very thorough and very biological reevaluation." I didn't move toward the door. The sheer gravity in David Hayes's voice rooted my feet to the floor. Slowly, cautiously, as if the room itself were lined with tripwires, I walked back to my chair at the far end of the oak table and sat down. Arthur Pendleton's face had lost all its color. He looked at the wax-sealed envelope in Hayes's hands as though it were an active grenade. "David," Pendleton stammered, his voice trembling, "I have been Ronald's primary counsel for 35 years. I drafted that will. He never mentioned a codicil." "Because he knew you would try to talk him out of it, Arthur," Hayes replied evenly, slipping a thick stack of documents from the envelope. "Ronald was a man who obsessed over legacy, but more than legacy, he obsessed over loyalty. And 10 years ago, he discovered a betrayal so profound, it fundamentally altered his view of this family." Victoria let out a short, dismissive scoff, though her perfectly manicured hands were now gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles were translucent. "This is a farce. Dad was of sound mind until the very end. Whatever forged garbage you have in your hands, these documents are authenticated, notarized, and backed by a sworn affidavit from the late Dr. Leonard Kessler, former chief of oncology at Mount Sinai," Hayes interrupted, his voice cutting through her panic like a steel blade. He laid 3 separate files on the table. "I suggest you listen very carefully, Victoria." Hayes adjusted his glasses, looking down at the heavy, parchment-like paper. 10 years ago, Ronald Sterling was diagnosed with a severe case of aplastic anemia. It was kept out of the press to protect the stock price of Sterling Logistics. He desperately needed a bone marrow transplant to survive. I frowned, remembering the brief period my mother had mentioned Ronald being abroad for a health retreat. He had never told me. But then, why would he? "As is standard procedure," Hayes continued, "his immediate family was tested for a human leukocyte antigen, or HLA match. Victoria and Preston, you both submitted blood samples at his private clinic on the Upper East Side. Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his silk tie. We didn't match. The doctors said it was rare, but it happens. Dad found an anonymous donor on the registry. What does this have to do with anything? It is true that you did not match for the marrow transplant, Hayes said softly, the quietness of his voice amplifying the dread in the room. But the HLA typing revealed something else entirely. The genetic markers in your blood lacked a mandatory 50% inheritance from Ronald Sterling. Baffled, Ronald ordered Dr. Kessler to run a comprehensive, localized DNA paternity test using the samples you had already provided. The silence in the room became an absolute, suffocating vacuum. I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of Preston's Rolex. The results were conclusive, Hayes stated, tapping a finger against the first file. Probability of paternity, 0%. Neither of you shares a single drop of Ronald Sterling's blood. You're a liar! Victoria shrieked, shooting up from her chair. Her designer sunglasses clattered onto the hardwood floor. My mother was Eleanor Bancroft. She was a saint. She came from one of the most respected families in New England. Your mother, Hayes countered smoothly, carried on a 15-year affair with Ronald's former CFO, Harrison Caldwell. A fact Ronald confirmed through a private investigator shortly after he received the DNA results. He had known Harrison since college. He recognized the timeline. He recognized the physical traits once he actually looked for them. I stared at Victoria and Preston. The resemblance to Ronald, the sharp jawline, the piercing eyes had always seemed present to me, but now, looking at them, I realized it was entirely fabricated by my own insecurities. They didn't look like Ronald. They looked like old money, tailored suits, and entitlement. Why didn't he divorce her? Arthur Pendleton whispered, rubbing his temples in disbelief. He could have destroyed her in court. Because of his pride, I spoke up, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. Everyone turned to look at me. A public divorce, a paternity scandal, it would have made him look like a fool. Ronald Sterling never allowed himself to look like a fool. He would rather live a lie than be pitied by his rivals. Hayes offered me a brief, approving nod. Exactly, Miss Jennings. Ronald valued his public image above all else. Eleanor passed away shortly after his diagnosis, taking her secret to the grave, or so she thought. Ronald allowed the charade to continue. He watched you both, Hayes said, turning his gaze back to Victoria and Preston, parade around Greenwich as the heirs to his empire. And he plotted. Hayes picked up the codicil. Ronald's primary will left everything to his real children. He demanded that phrase be read aloud today, because in this codicil, he legally defines that term. Hayes cleared his throat and began to read Ronald's unmistakable, ruthless words. I, Ronald Alistair Sterling, having discovered the profound deceit of my late wife Eleanor, do hereby execute this contingent codicil. The primary will dictates that my estate be divided among my real children. Let the courts recognize that biology, not a fraudulent marriage certificate, determines reality. Victoria and Preston are the offspring of Harrison Caldwell. They are strangers to my bloodline. Therefore, my entire estate, every share of Sterling Logistics, every property, every liquid asset held in trust, shall bypass them entirely. It is bequeathed in its absolute entirety to my sole biological offspring, my only real child, Lucy Jennings. The room spun. My vision blurred for a fraction of a second. I gripped the edge of the oak table to anchor myself. The billion-dollar logistics empire, the mansions, the legacy. He didn't give it to me out of love. He gave it to me out of vengeance. I was simply the blunt instrument he chose to bludgeon his fake family from beyond the grave. It was the most twisted, vindictive, and undeniably Ronald thing I had ever witnessed. As for Victoria and Preston, Hayes read on, his tone devoid of pity, I leave them the sum of $1 each. Let it be known that my wealth belongs only to my real children. For 10 agonizing seconds, the grand conference room of Pendleton, Royce, and Hayes felt like the inside of a tomb. Then, the dam broke. I will bury you! Preston roared, slamming his fists onto the table so hard the water glasses rattled. He pointed a trembling finger at Hayes, then at me. This is a setup. You two colluded to forge this document. I am the executive vice president of Sterling Logistics. I have run the European division for 6 years. You've run it into the ground, Preston, Hayes replied, entirely unbothered by the outburst. Victoria was hyperventilating, her hands clutching her chest. Arthur, do something, she gasped, her carefully constructed facade crumbling into pure desperation. He can't do this. We grew up in that house. We are his legal children, regardless of some fabricated blood test. The courts won't allow a bastard child to usurp the legal heirs. Arthur Pendleton looked like a man who had aged 20 years in the span of 5 minutes. He slowly closed his leather binder. Victoria, if what David is holding is a legally executed codicil, accompanied by certified medical records and chain of custody affidavits, it is ironclad. Ronald established the semantic loophole himself in the primary will. By explicitly tying the inheritance to the phrase real children, he opened the door for biological definition. We'll tie this up in probate for decades. Preston spat, glaring at me with a hatred so pure it felt radioactive. You won't see a dime, Lucy. I will spend every cent I have dragging you through the mud. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be begging to go back to whatever rat-infested apartment you crawled out of. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs, a chaotic bird trapped in my chest. The old Lucy, the girl who hid in the shadows, the girl who accepted the scraps of Ronald's existence, wanted to run. She wanted to wave the inheritance just to escape the venom in Preston's eyes. But then I remembered the loan I had taken out to bury my mother. I remembered Ronald telling me to send the bill to his assistant. I remembered Victoria's sneer at the cemetery, and Preston couldn't even be bothered to look up from his Rolex. They had treated me like dirt my entire life because they thought they were royalty. I sat up straight, squaring my shoulders. I looked Preston dead in the eye. If you want to go to war, Preston, I suggest you make sure your own armor isn't cracked. I didn't actually know what I was talking about, but the words felt good. However, David Hayes knew exactly what I was doing, and he seamlessly picked up the baton. Speaking of cracked armor, Hayes said, reaching into his briefcase one final time. He pulled out a thick manila folder and slid it across the polished oak toward Preston. Before you call your litigation team, you might want to review the contents of this secondary audit. Preston stopped yelling. He looked down at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. While your father was busy investigating your mother's infidelities, he also began keeping a much closer eye on the company books, Hayes explained, his tone conversational but laced with lethal intent. Specifically, the European division. The division you manage. Preston's face drained of the angry red, replaced by a sickly, chalky white. Over the past 6 years, approximately $42 million has been funneled through dummy shell corporations based in the Cayman Islands. Companies registered under the maiden name of your wife, Preston. Hayes tapped the folder. Ronald had forensic accountants compile every wire transfer, every doctored invoice, every encrypted email. Victoria turned to her brother, her eyes wide with horror. Preston, what did you do? Preston couldn't speak. He sank back into his chair, his swagger entirely evaporated. Ronald was prepared to hand this over to the federal authorities, Hayes continued. But he decided to leave the choice to his real heir. The codicil includes a final stipulation. Hayes looked directly at me, handing me a silver pen. Miss Jennings, you have a choice. If Victoria and Preston agree to sign immediate waivers, relinquishing any right to contest the will, vacating the Sterling properties within 14 days, and signing ironclad non-disclosure agreements regarding this entire affair, they will each receive a severance trust of $2 million. Hayes turned his cold gaze back to the siblings. If, however, they choose to contest the will, Miss Jennings is instructed, as the sole executor of the estate, to immediately forward this forensic audit to the SEC and the Department of Justice. Embezzlement of that scale carries a mandatory federal prison sentence of up to 20 years. The trap had sprung. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. Ronald had anticipated their greed, their anger, and he had handed me the loaded gun to stop them. 2 million? Victoria whispered, tears finally spilling over her mascara, leaving dark tracks down her cheeks. The Aspen house alone is worth 15. How are we supposed to live on $2 million? You'll have to learn to budget, Victoria, I said. My voice was calm, steady, and unrecognizable to my own ears. I recommend clipping coupons. It's what my mother and I did when your father forgot to send child support. Preston was staring blankly at the wall, his hands shaking slightly. He knew he was beaten. The threat of losing the fortune was awful. The threat of federal prison was absolute. Where do we sign? Preston choked out, his voice barely a whisper. Arthur Pendleton, looking thoroughly defeated, slid a series of standard waiver forms across the table. For the next 10 minutes, the only sound in the room was the scratching of pens on paper. Victoria cried silently as she signed away the only identity she had ever known. Preston signed his name with the frantic, terrified speed of a man with a gun to his head. When they were finished, Hayes collected the documents, meticulously checking the signatures and the notary stamps. The transition team will be in touch regarding the vacating of the residential properties, Hayes told them. I suggest you begin packing immediately. Victoria and Preston didn't say another word. They stood up, looking stripped, hollowed out. They didn't look like Sterlings anymore. They just looked like two frightened, unemployed people. They walked out of the conference room, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind them, sealing their exit from the empire forever. I sat at the massive oak table, the sole occupant of the space they had commanded just an hour prior. Well, Miss Jennings, Hayes said, organizing the mountain of paperwork and placing it into a pristine leather folio. Or, I suppose I should say, Miss Sterling. We have an incredible amount of work to do. Sterling Logistics has a board meeting on Thursday, and they are expecting to meet their new chairwoman. I looked down at the single-dollar bill that Hayes had placed on the table earlier, the initial insult that had triggered the avalanche. I picked it up, folded it neatly, and put it in my pocket. A reminder of where I came from, and the cold, ruthless man who had unexpectedly given me the world. The boardroom at Sterling Logistics was located on the top floor of a glass monolith at 55 Water Street in the financial district, offering a commanding, dizzying view of the East River. On Thursday morning, exactly 48 hours after I had legally stripped my half-siblings of their inheritance and their identities, I stepped off the private elevator. I was wearing a tailored navy suit that had cost me nearly my entire remaining savings account, an armor woven from fine Italian wool. David Hayes walked half a step behind me, carrying the leather folio containing the certified legal transition documents. The hushed whispers of the executive floor died instantly as I walked down the corridor. They knew. In the corporate world, bloodless coups are the loudest secrets. When I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom, 12 men and 2 women in bespoke suits stopped talking. They stared at me as if a ghost had just walked in. Arthur Pendleton sat at the far end, looking gray and utterly exhausted. Beside him was the empty, high-backed leather chair that had belonged to Ronald Sterling for 4 decades. "Good morning," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the absolute terror vibrating in my chest. I walked directly past the bewildered executives and took the seat at the head of the table. The leather was still stiff. Ronald had rarely sat back in it, preferring to lean forward and intimidate. I mirrored his posture. William Thatcher, a senior board member with a reputation for ruthless cost-cutting, cleared his throat. "Miss Jennings, this is an unprecedented transition. While Arthur has briefed us on the legal standing of the codicil, the board has grave concerns about the continuity of leadership. You have no experience in global logistics, Preston. Preston has been permanently terminated, effective immediately, pending an internal forensic audit," I interrupted, my tone freezing Thatcher's words in his throat. I opened my own folder, sliding a single sheet of paper down the table. For the past 6 years, Preston Sterling has been embezzling corporate funds through a shell company network in the Cayman Islands. The total missing capital is $42 million. If you, Mr. Thatcher, as the head of the audit committee, would like to explain to the board how you missed this catastrophic hemorrhage of company funds. I am more than willing to yield the floor. The color rapidly drained from Thatcher's face. The rest of the board members shifted uncomfortably, suddenly staring at their notepads. I didn't think so, I said quietly. My mother raised me to balance a checkbook to the very last cent. I expect the same from a billion-dollar logistics firm. We are bringing in an independent auditing firm on Monday. If anyone in this room is uncomfortable with transparency, I suggest you tender your resignation to Mr. Hayes by 5 o'clock today. Now, let's review the European quarterlies. It was a bluff of massive proportions, but it worked. The room fell into line. They didn't respect me yet, but they feared the ghost of Ronald Sterling that clearly resided in my willingness to cut them down. A week later, I drove a rented sedan up the winding, meticulously manicured driveway of the Sterling estate in Greenwich. Victoria and Preston had vacated the premises under the cover of darkness, taking their allotted $2 million and disappearing from the New York Social Register. The house was a sprawling, stone-clad monstrosity of wealth. Walking through the echoing, empty halls felt like trespassing in a museum. The air smelled faintly of Victoria's heavy, floral perfume and stale privilege. I wandered past the grand dining room, the indoor pool, and finally, into Ronald's private library. The room was lined with floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves, smelling of old paper and expensive scotch. Sitting on the center of the massive oak desk was a single cardboard box. David Hayes was leaning against the window frame, watching the rain gently tap against the glass. He turned as I entered. "The transition is complete," Hayes said, his voice softer here than in the boardroom. "The deed has been recorded in your name. Pendleton has officially retired, and I've been appointed chief legal counsel for the estate." "Thank you, David," I said, trailing my fingers across the leather surface of the desk. "I couldn't have navigated this without you." "Your father chose me for a reason, Lucy. He knew Pendleton was too weak to handle the fallout." Hayes walked over to the desk and tapped the cardboard box. "This was the final instruction in the codicil, to be given to you only after you successfully took the chair at the board meeting and secured the property." I frowned, looking at the battered box. "What is it?" "His personal effects from the office vault. But specifically," Hayes reached into the box and pulled out a small, worn, black leather journal. Its edges were frayed, a stark contrast to the pristine, curated life Ronald led. "He wanted you to read this. Alone. I'll see myself out, Miss Sterling." Hayes offered a polite nod and quietly left the library, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him. I stood in the silence of my new empire, staring at the black journal. My hands trembled slightly as I picked it up. The leather was soft from years of use. I sat down in Ronald's heavy desk chair and opened the cover. The handwriting was unmistakably his sharp, aggressive, slanted. The early entries dated back to 1996, the year before I was born. April 14th, 1996. Sarah continues to outpace the senior analysts. She presented the routing algorithm for the Mid-Atlantic corridor today. It's flawless. She trims delivery times by 18% while cutting fuel costs. The board was ecstatic. I took the credit. She didn't say a word. She never does. My breath hitched. My mother? Sarah Jennings, the quiet, exhausted woman who worked a second job at a diner just to afford my winter coats? I flipped the pages frantically. October 2nd, 1996. The affair is over. She's pregnant. I offered her a vice presidency to stay quiet, to keep building the systems. She refused. She said she wouldn't raise a child in a world built on stolen credit and lies. I paid her a lump sum. I drafted the NDAs. She signed them without looking at the money. I kept her algorithm. Will make me my first billion. Tears, hot and sudden, spilled down my cheeks, splashing onto the aged paper. The Sterling Empire, the logistics network, the automated routing systems, the absolute dominance of the East Coast supply chain, it wasn't Ronald's genius. It was Sarah's. It was my mother's mind that had built the foundation of this immense wealth. I turned to the very last page of the journal. The ink was fresh, the handwriting slightly shakier. It was dated a month before he died. The blood test 10 years ago proved Eleanor's children were parasites. But I knew that long before the doctors told me. They never had the mind for the business. They were soft, entitled. I've watched Lucy from a distance. I saw her graduate night school with top honors in accounting, working 2 jobs, just like Sarah. She has the grit, she has the fire, but more importantly, she has her mother's blood. I am not leaving Lucy the company to punish Victoria and Preston. The dollar bill is for them. The empire is for her. I am leaving Lucy the company because it was never mine to begin with. It was Sarah's. I stole it from her mother, and in my final hour, I am returning it to the rightful architect. Let the real bloodline rule. I closed the journal, the leather cool against my damp palms. The crushing weight of the imposter syndrome that had plagued me since the will reading instantly evaporated. I wasn't just a biological loophole. I wasn't a weapon forged for a dead man's vengeance. I looked up, staring out the window at the sprawling, rain-soaked grounds of the estate. The empire wasn't a gift, and it wasn't an apology. It was restitution. I folded the single-dollar bill I had kept from the will reading and tucked it inside my mother's journal, placing them both securely in the desk drawer. The ghost of Ronald Sterling no longer haunted me, and the shadow of his fake family had been entirely erased. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, looking out over my domain. I was Lucy Jennings, the architect's daughter, and it was finally time to get to work.